Chapter 5. The Green Sea. Tiffany flew a few inches above the ground, standing still. Wind rushed around her as the Feagles sped out of the farmyard's top gate and onto the turf of the downs. This is the girl, flying. At the moment there's a toad on her head, holding onto her hair. Pull back, and here is the long green whaleback of the downs. Now she's a pale blue dot against the endless grass, mowed by the sheep to the length of a carpet. But the green sea isn't unbroken. Here and there humans have been. Last year Tiffany had spent 3 carrots and an apple on half an hour of geology, although she'd been refunded a carrot after explaining to the teacher that geology shouldn't be spelled on his sign as G-O-L-L-Y-G. He said that the chalk had been formed underwater millions of years before from tiny seashells. That made sense to Tiffany. Sometimes you found little fossils in the chalk, but the teacher didn't know much about the flint. You found flints harder than steel in chalk, the softest of rocks. Sometimes the shepherds chipped the flints, one flint against another, into knives. Not even the best steel knives could take an edge as sharp as flint. And men in what was called on the chalk the olden days had dug pits for it. They were still there, deep holes in the rolling green, filled with thickets of thorn and brambles. Huge knobbly flints still turned up in the village gardens too. Sometimes they were larger than a man's head. They often looked like heads too. They were so melted and twisted and curved that you could look at a flint and see almost anything. A face, a strange animal, a sea monster. Sometimes the more interesting ones would be put on garden walls, for show. The old people called these calkins, which meant chalk children. They'd always seemed odd to Tiffany, as if the stone was striving to become alive. Some flints looked like bits of meat or bones or something off a butcher's slab. In the dark, under the sea, it looked as though the chalk had been trying to make the shapes of living creatures. There weren't just the chalk pits. Men had been everywhere on the chalk. There were stone circles half fallen down, and burial mounds like green pimples where it was said chieftains of the olden days had been buried with their treasure. No one fancied digging into them to find out. There were odd carvings in the chalk too, which the shepherds sometimes weeded when they were out on the downs with the flocks, and there was not a lot to do. The chalk was only a few inches under the turf. Hoof prints could last a season, but the carvings had lasted for thousands of years. There were pictures of horses and giants, but the strange thing was that you couldn't see them properly from anywhere on the ground. They looked as if they'd been made for viewers in the sky. And then there were the weird places like Old Man's Forge, which was just 4 big flat rocks placed so they made a kind of half-buried hut in the side of a mound. It was only a few feet deep. It didn't look anything special, but if you shouted your name into it, it was several seconds before the echo came back. There were signs of people everywhere. The chalk had been important. Tiffany left the shearing sheds way behind. No one was watching. Sheared sheep took no notice at all of a girl moving without her feet touching the ground. The lowlands dropped away behind her, and now she was properly on the downs. Only the occasional baa of a sheep or scream of a buzzard disturbed a busy silence, made up of bee buzzes and breezes and the sound of a ton of grass growing every minute. On either side of Tiffany, the Nakmak Feagles ran in a spread-out ragged line, staring grimly ahead. They passed some of the mounds without stopping and ran up and down the sides of shallow valleys without a pause. And it was then that Tiffany saw a landmark ahead. It was a small flock of sheep. There were only a few freshly sheared, but there were always a handful of sheep at this place now. Strays would turn up there, and lambs would find their way to it when they'd lost their mothers. This was a magic place. There wasn't much to see now, just the iron wheels sinking into the turf and the pot-bellied stove with its short chimney. On the day Granny Aching died, the men had cut and lifted the turf around the hut and stacked it neatly some way away. Then they dug a deep hole in the chalk, 6 feet deep and 6 feet long, lifting out the chalk in great damp blocks. Thunder and Lightning had watched them carefully. They didn't whine or bark. They seemed more interested than upset. Granny Aching had been wrapped in a woolen blanket with a tuft of raw wool pinned to it. That was a special shepherd thing. It was there to tell any gods who might get involved that the person being buried there was a shepherd and spent a lot of time on the hills. What with lambing and one thing and another, couldn't always take much time out for religion, there being no churches or temples up there, and therefore it was generally hoped that the gods would understand and look kindly on them. Granny Aching, it had to be said, had never been seen to pray to anyone or anything in her life, and it was agreed by all that even now she wouldn't have any time for a god who didn't understand that lambing came first. The chalk had been put back over her, and Granny Aching, who always said that the hills were in her bones, now had her bones in the hills. Then they burned the hut. That wasn't usual, but her father had said that there wasn't a shepherd anywhere on the chalk who'd use it now. Thunder and lightning wouldn't come when he called, and he knew better than to be angry. So they were left sitting quite contentedly by the glowing embers of the hut. Next day, when the ashes were cold and blowing across the raw chalk, everyone went up onto the downs and with very great care put the turf back, so all that was left to see were the iron wheels on their axles and the pot-bellied stove. At which point, so everyone said, the two sheepdogs had looked up, their ears pricking, and had trotted away over the turf and were never seen again. The Pixies, carrying her, slowed down gently, and Tiffany flailed her arms as they dropped her onto the grass. The sheep lumbered away slowly, then stopped and turned to watch her. Why are we stopping? Why are we stopping here? We've got to catch her. Got to wait for Hamish, mistress, said Rob Anybody. Why, who's Hamish? He might have the knowing of where the Quinn went with your wee laddie, said Rob Anybody soothingly. We canna just rush in, you can. A big bearded Feagle raised his hand. Point of order, big man. You can just rush in. We always just rush in. Aye, Big Jan, point well made, but you got to know where you're just gonna rush in. You can't just rush in anywhere. It looks bad having to rush out again, straight away. Tiffany saw that the Feagles were staring intently upwards and paying her no attention at all. Angry and puzzled, she sat down on one of the rusty wheels and looked at the sky. It was better than looking around. There was Granny Aching's grave somewhere around here, although you couldn't find it now, not precisely. The turf had healed. There were a few little clouds above her, and nothing else at all, except the distant circling dots of the buzzards. There were always buzzards over the chalk. The shepherds had taken to calling them Granny Aching's chickens, and some of them called clouds like those up there today, Granny's little lambs. And Tiffany knew that even her father called the thunder Granny Aching cussin'. And it was said that some of the shepherds, if wolves were troublesome in the winter, or a prize ewe had got lost, would go to the site of the old hut in the hills and leave an ounce of Jolly Sailor tobacco just in case. Tiffany hesitated. Then she shut her eyes. I want that to be true, she whispered to herself. I want to know that other people think she hasn't really gone too. She looked under the wide rusted rim of the wheels and shivered. There was a brightly coloured little packet there. She picked it up. It looked quite fresh, so it had probably been there for only a few days. There was the Jolly Sailor on the front, with his big grin and big yellow rain hat and big beard, with big blue waves crashing behind him. Tiffany had learned about the sea from the Jolly Sailor wrappings. She'd heard it was big and roared. There was a tower in the sea which was a lighthouse that carried a big light on it at night to stop boats crashing into the rocks. In the pictures, the beam of the lighthouse was brilliant white. She knew about it so well she dreamed about it, and had woken up with the roar of the sea in her ears. She'd heard one of her uncles say that if you looked at the tobacco label upside down, then part of the hat and the sailor's ear and a bit of his collar made up a picture of a woman with no clothes on. But Tiffany had never been able to make it out, and couldn't see what the point would be in any case. She carefully pulled the label off the packet and sniffed at it. It smelled of Granny. She felt her eyes begin to fill with tears. She'd never cried for Granny Aching before, never. She cried for dead lambs, and cut fingers, and for not getting her own way, but never for Granny. It hadn't seemed right. And I'm not crying now, she thought, carefully putting the label in her apron pocket. Not for Granny being dead.